Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I'm very excited for this discussion today. Brett, good to see you, friend, comrade. Shout out to Revolutionary Left Radio, always. Good to see you too, Jared. Nice to see you. Good morning, everybody. All right. So we will get into it. I see there's already critiques in the chat. I'm looking forward to that too. So first, let me just welcome our guest here. So I should have asked for a pronunciation on this. I apologize. Correct me when you come on. Joma Geneciran is a PhD student in global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine, focusing on political economy and the agrarian question of national liberation in the Philippines. They organize in the ND, which is the National Democratic Movement, and elsewhere. They also co-host a new Third Worldist podcast, JD Pod, which there's an acronym they're playing with there, so I'll let them explain that as well. Checked it out. Really like the work that they and their comrade are doing over there. And so we'll get into this discussion here in a minute. I did want to say a couple of things up front. One, obviously, we feature a number of people who work within decolonial theory, within decolonial studies in the academy. So in no way are we trying to be like, just browbeating the whole discipline of everybody. We know that there's a limited number of academic disciplines that people who are trying to do radical work can work within. But we also want to be critical, right? That's the whole point of Marxism, of, radical anything, right? Is to critique the tools that we're using to try to improve them, and to, improve our theory and practice. So anyways, Joma, welcome. It's good to be with you, my friend. Excited for this conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. I'm excited to be with you too.
So before we go further, let's just give folks a little bit of background on you and how you're coming to this. I know that you're involved in other cool stuff and work. You've mentioned to me that you spent time organizing in the Philippines as well. And, as we just mentioned, the podcast you just launched, so you could say a little bit about that. But just introduce yourself a little bit to our audience and say a little bit about, whatever you want to share kind of about your own political journey to this point.
Sure. So my name is Joma Geneciran. I'm a third-year PhD student in Global and International Studies at UCI. I did my master's in anthropology at the University of Chicago and my bachelor's in political science. And I immediately kind of ran from political science as I realized some of the methodological limitations I was facing. But this was at a liberal arts school in Florida. Recently, it's become dismantled. It's called New College of Florida, but it's become sort of the hotbed of like the culture wars under DeSantis there. I just started a Third Worldist podcast called JD Pod, which is a playoff of JD Pon, which stands for the Joint Dictatorship of the Proletariat of Oppressed Nations. And so we're just playing around with the acronym there, a podcast, JD Pod. And that's with someone who was in my PhD program. They decided to leave and are doing really great work elsewhere in the world of law, doing public defense stuff and that sort of thing. So in that episode, though, in our introductory episode, I sort of go into my background in more detail. So for those that are interested, they can refer to there. But the Cliff Note version is that I grew up in Florida, and that was not by choice. My dad, who he recently earlier this year passed from pancreatic cancer, was a medic in the U.S. Air Force, and which is where I met my mom, who is Filipina. And that's a really common story for Filipinos in the diaspora. You have a father who's in the military, a Filipina who's was forced to migrate, and we end up somewhere in the Imperial Corps, typically. Eventually, I became politically conscious through basically the punk hardcore scene, which took the form of basically an anarchist disposition. From 2014 to 2017, I organized sort of an anti-fascist affinity groups. From 2017 to 2020, I was involved with direct action with various like environmental and anti-colonial movements. Where I was, which was basically around the Orlando area, is where the American Indian movement is pretty active. Leonard Peltier is still held in Coleman Prison there. His 80th birthday just passed. And so a lot of that, where I was, that's where I was situated. And so at that time, I was also working in undergrad. I went to community college. It took me 9 years to finish undergrad. And in that time, I was working 3 to 4 jobs at any time. And my political education, a lot of it was through podcasts, listening to podcasts while I'm driving, doing a side hustle here, a gig economy job there, working overnights at a gym. And so that was my, I learned much more from that than I did in any seminar. And at that period, I was working on Rojava, or North and East Syria. And so my politics were anarchist bent, social ecology bent. I was sort of in the phase between some sort of anarchist Marxist synthesis of some sort. And around 2019 to 2020, I started organizing with the New African Black Panther Party, and they have a mass organization called the United Panther Movement. And they upheld Huey P. Newton's theory of revolutionary intercommunalism, which we can maybe talk about if anyone's interested, because it does come up when we think about the national question. And then and then from there, I moved to Chicago for my MA, and that's when I got involved with the National Democratic Movement, which brings us to the present. And I also just returned from the Philippines. This summer I was there, starting to do field work, sort of getting to know different regions, different organizations. I was in Manila. I was visiting family in Pampanga, which is just north. And then I was all the way down south in Mindanao, which is the most southern island. It's basically the breadbasket of the Philippines. You have a lot of banana, a lot of rice, a lot of sugar. And so I was on various different plantations, visiting farmers, getting a sense of the contradictions, which is heavily militarized, especially in Mindanao. And so while I was there, I was organizing with various indie movement organizations, unions. Those that are familiar with Gabriela, with Amihan, with Kabataan Alliance. So these are indie movement organizations. Some of them are above board, some of them are below. But also that divide is very fluid. So I guess I would end. I guess I describe my politics as national democratic, which is theorizing from my positionality as a Filipino American, and I say American with 3 Ks. And I want national liberation from various forms of imperialism and monopoly capitalism to win democratic rights for the broadest masses of people. So that's influenced by Leninism, by Mao Zedong thought, but it can also be understood, or perhaps even more legibly, as scientific socialism or third worldism or Pan-African synthesis of some sort.
Right on. So thank you for that background. So I appreciated this piece. Obviously there's, I talk to a lot of people on this podcast who are in the academy. Decolonial theory, well, it is not something I've never studied, like to go to sort of the foundational texts of decolonial theory to sort of, study its kind of trajectory. Like I read a lot of stuff that is in the national liberation tradition in anti-colonial in some ways, or Fanon and, so on. But it's something that comes up in a lot of books that you read, the phrase decolonial, thinking about decoloniality or coloniality. And, it's particularly prominent among a lot of left-wing or, radical academics who use a lot of different kind of, I guess, theories, right? Or they're fitting within different disciplines in the academy. And so I think the 8 questions that you raise or created, are really helpful, right? In thinking with kind of, I almost think any theory that we're looking at, like we should be trying to, and it's things like when I read different books over the years in study groups, we do a lot of study groups with millennials. These are things that'll come up like, okay, this is really neat, but what do I do with it? Like, how do I, how could I use this with my friends as we're trying to organize, right? Those kind of things. And so before, we get into kind of those questions, and we're going to look through some of the quotes and the passages you're analyzing in the text. But could you talk a little bit about like your own encounter with this stuff, and maybe what started to, make you feel like I need to approach this a little bit more critically in terms of how I engage with this?
Yeah. So I first came across coloniality or decoloniality in undergrad. Um, I was taking a post-colonial geography course with someone that studied at Berkeley in geography, and they'd recently graduated. And I think their advisor was Raymond Grosfagel, and we had read a piece that I absolutely loved in that class. Um, it was called, I wrote it down because I wanted to, because it has a long name. The Structure of Knowledge in Westernized Universities, Epistemic Racism, Sexism, and the Four Genocides or Epistemicides of the Long 16th Century. And so that builds off of the work of the Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel, and really drives home that epistemic critique that is really not the only, but is the hallmark, I think, of what separates the decolonial critique. And I was captivated by it. At this point, I was reading Öcalan, I was reading Bookchin, I was researching social ecology. I was sort of between anarchism and Marxism. And so I was really thinking deeply about in that tradition. Several years later, I attended the South-South Decolonial Dialogues, which is put on by Roman Grosfagel. I think Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore does as well. Typically, it's held in Barcelona. That year, we did it on Zoom because of COVID. And so that I was in conversations with decolonial scholars from everywhere imaginable. And it was really rich. So that's my sort of where I came across it. In my current PhD program, we have a lot of scholars that work within the decolonial tradition. And so in all of my class, in many of my classes, we're reading decolonial theory in some way. And so that's where I've come across it. And where this emerged was out of a course. It was called, I think it was Anti-Colonial, Post-Colonial, and Decolonial Theories. And it was in this course, it was a final paper where I was thinking through Walter Mignolo's on decoloniality, and Catherine Walsh is a co-author for that piece. And that piece, it was like, I think the third time that we'd been assigned it, and in 3 different classes. And so I think that's partly why I chose to focus on it, because it gets assigned so much. It's become sort of the recommended text to think about decoloniality. And of course, this is a heterogeneous tradition. And so even in the piece, I specify saying, like, I'm not trying to wash all of decoloniality as like this is the fullness of the tradition, but I'm focusing specifically on Walter Mignolo's on decoloniality for the reasons that I came across it so much. It was a lot of times when you're creating a syllabus for undergrads or whatever, you get maybe 30 pages that you know that they're going to read within the time. And so you have to pick and choose. And so that's why I chose that text.
Right on. Somebody asked this question, I think it would be good for the audience too, and myself. Like, could you explain, what the decolonial tradition means in academia? I realize that's a big question, but like, how do you understand this tradition?
Yeah. Well, so it's difficult to pin down because it can mean many things to many people and many different disciplines, many different fields, which is partly why why it has such staying power in the academy. And partly why I wrote the piece, to sort of at least start to begin asking questions and thinking about it critically. I think maybe it might help to think through difference, to think about in response to post-colonial or in response to anti-colonial, or in differentiations from anti-colonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial, the different colonials. And so you could do that thinking through, I don't know, intellectual genealogy and history with post-colonialism. You have Edward Said, you got your Spivak, Homi Bhabha, various national liberation movements. With the anti-colonial, you have Amilcar Cabral and Guinea-Bissau, Samora Machel in Mozambique, Fanon in Algeria, Jose Maria Sison, my namesake, in the Philippines. For neocolonialism, of course, you have Kwame Nkrumah. And of course, these aren't exhaustive, just sort of trying to paint a broader picture. With decoloniality, the way that I'm approaching it and the way that I've experienced it, a lot of times the intellectual origins are from Latin America. Many intellectual histories will trace it via way of the modernity coloniality working group, which began with the work of the late Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano on the colonial matrix of power. There was a paper, it was translated, I think, in 2000, called The Coloniality of Power in Latin America, something like that, where he talks about the colonial matrix of power. And I'm pretty sure Gross-Fogel also talks about it in that piece I mentioned earlier, the four epistemicides piece. But part of the working group, you have folks like Catherine Walsh, who co-edited with Walter Mignolo. You have Sylvia Winter, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Santiago Castro Gomez, Maria Lugones, people that are working on epistemologies of the South. I think DeSantos, I forget his name now. Boaventura Sua, I'm blanking, but is another of these folks. But I think if we think of decoloniality, we're going to use Walter Mignolo as a quote as an example from Decoloniality. And he writes, decoloniality, and this is a quote, disobeys and delinks from the colonial matrix of power, constructing paths and praxis toward an otherwise of thinking, sensing, believing, doing, and living, unquote. And so you can ask, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? And that's where the questions come in to try to tease it out. And there are moments where he gets concrete. And the piece begins with questions that I think was really helpful that he asks. Let me just pull up the epitaph of the piece. He writes, the answer to the question, what does it mean to decolonize, cannot be an abstract universal. It has to be answered by looking at other W questions. Who is doing it, where, why, and how? Which I think is really, which is what I'm also arguing. I think he's spot on there. But with the coloniality of power critique, it starts, he describes, so he being Aníbal Quijano, describes coloniality of power as a global system of domination that began to form with the colonization of the Americas in 1492 and persists even after formal decolonization. And it's characterized by racial classification, the hierarchical organization of labor, as well as Eurocentric knowledge systems. So it's a critique that's very similar to neocolonialism in that regard. It's like, even though you have formal decolonization, you have flag independence, you have a seat at the UN, you're still embedded in this matrix of power. In a way that I would articulate this problematic now is to say that imperialism operates on a world scale and independence can create the maneuvering room to be able to delink from that subordinated position, to be able to transition your subordinated pool of development of whatever region we're talking about. But it doesn't equate liberation. It's like the question is like, what is this newly independent state's relationship to accumulation on a world scale? These are the questions that how I would problematize it now. But I think what Walter Mignolo is interested in is and critical of is that independence did not equal liberation. So the decolonial period, you then had comprador elites in these countries that sold out the country, the broader masses, to U.S. capital, to U.S.-led imperialism, to whatever. And so there's a shared critique of the limitations of the period of decolonization, but I think I take it in a different direction as to the reasons why that why it unfolded the way that it did.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so one of the things, I mean, where I wanted to go is to go sort of to the questions and kind of how you came up with them, which maybe that'll give us a little bit too. I mean, I think that's what you're pointing to is something also that there's a tension there that I also feel, right? Which is that um, there is this era of decolonization, this era of national independence, right? And there are certain states who take that project and they try to build socialism. Maybe they do try to delink, they try to join other, whether it's the socialist bloc or the non-aligned movement, and are really trying to think, critically about kind of national development, sovereignty, towards a more emancipatory, liberatory project, right? And like obviously there's a whole bunch of issues. There is this like web of power, right? That makes that process very difficult. Um, and there are, nation states that do just become comprador, that do just become client states, that do just become part of the Western, US imperialist led bloc. And then you have the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And you have also then, coming with the 90s, like, you know, IMF, World Bank, neoliberalism. I mean, we're talking about very major overarching issues that make real decolonization, real liberation, real socialism, these things very hard for any individual state or even a set of states to try to figure out how do we navigate these things together. And so I guess before we get to the questions, like say a little bit about how you feel about that problem and how you orient your own thinking towards that, because I do think that a lot of what I read certainly within the post-colonial school, but a little bit also within some of the decolonial school, is sort of like that there's all these other areas where people needed to decolonize their thought or decolonize this, etc., in order to be able to actually, transition to a sort of liberatory horizon. I don't fully disagree with that. Like I think that's important. And we could think about what does that actually mean. Um, but I don't also necessarily think that it's going to be sufficient also by itself. So anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I understand it in a similar way, or the same way, probably. That decolonizing your mind, decolonizing your culture, these things aren't bad. They're encouraged. I also don't see them as sufficient. And I think it's always most useful to think about concrete examples, and to then we can ask, like, what would it look like for Algeria uh, to approach from like decolonizing the mind to upend French colonization. And we look at history, we can see that. I think if anyone's hasn't, they should watch the Battle of Algiers. And if they get a chance, in A Dying Colonialism, Fanon talks about it a lot as well, the use of culture in the national liberation struggle. But the problematic of the limits of national liberation during this period, I think, is partly the limitation. What happens when struggle gets to a certain level, you reach new contradictions. And so we saw this with the student movement as well, which I was talking about with my comrade Nate, that there were critiques that we can have now because struggle got to a certain level. And before it got to that level, these contradictions weren't really faced in the ways that they were faced. And so now we can begin to synthesize and theorize what went wrong. How can we avoid it next go around, if we get a next go around? And so with the era of national liberation movements, you have a whole host of new contradictions that emerge. How do you now transition? So if you do become quote unquote independent, your poles of development, and by that I mean if your region, and I like to use the analysis of social formation, but we'll just use the country. If your country is oil rich, or is, let's use the Philippines as an example. If you're in Mindanao, and where I was in Cabatagago, it's a banana plantation essentially, where they only grow, like, probably 90% of the farmers and workers grow bananas for one specific company, Semifru, which is like this Japanese agribusiness. If your pool of development is growing bananas for export, how do you then transition Even with independence, these sort of neocolonial, so the colonizing power or whatever leaves, but you're still caught up in these webs of dependence. And here we have the critique of coloniality, which is there, also the critique of neocolonialism, which is there, that just because the colonizers have left, quote unquote, officially, these webs of dependence are still there. And so the problematic, though, is that you get independence, you say you build up a mass movement, and the people are organized, to then try to embark on some sort of autocentric development or some sort of delinking. How are you going to stay afloat against what Samir Amin calls the law of globalized value? Which, to say that in like normal human speaking terms, how are you going to compete with the flooding on the market by Chiquita Banana or these huge agribusinesses that can afford to subsidize and sell really cheap? And so the problematic then becomes, how can you provide for your people along this transition period while you're in the, and this is why the limitations of just at the nation state becomes apparent. And then you have to start talking about not just delinking, but reconnecting some sort of not federal, but some sort of regional perspective. And this goes back to Africa Must Unite, which can be upheld for other countries or other social formations as well.
Appreciated. Thank you. So let's walk through, like, how did you come to this set of questions? And I think because this is one of the areas that I can see some, maybe my read is it's kind of misreading going on in the chat right now, but like, um like, these questions, the way I understand you, well, let me say this, the way I understand you using these questions in the piece, right, is saying that it is not that none of these questions are answered under the whole broad camp of everything that's called decolonial theory, that you might read certain pieces that are within decolonial theory that are written by certain authors where they do address themselves to some, or maybe even all, I don't know, of these questions, right? But it is saying that this is a process for you that becomes helpful in when you're reading this kind of theory, to think with it, to say, what is this actually doing, and how is this practical or useful for liberation movements? That's the way I read it, and feel free to push back or disagree with me if I'm misrepresenting it. But I that's the way I took it. It wasn't, to me, saying that none of decolonial theory answers any of these questions, and so therefore it's all garbage or whatever. But it is to say these are tools that I've developed to, when I'm reading this stuff, to help me make sense of, and others make sense of, what's the utility of what's going on here. Um, Agree, disagree?
Agreed. Yeah. Decolonial. Decolonial would just happen to be what was being used because I was in a class on anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial theories, and I was reading a lot of decolonial work. These questions, I wasn't even when I began this piece, it didn't come with questions. When I was writing this paper, that sort of emerged organically, and honestly, it probably didn't even start with decolonial theory where these questions emerged. These were just questions when I was in anthropology reading ethnographies, and I'm like, well, for me, what is the point of of this ethnography I'm reading? Like, it didn't address questions that I found as important. Questions of where are the contradictions? What's the aim here? What's the political program? How can we explain this in a way that our children understand? And we can look through each of these questions later, but these were the things that I would come up with as in seminar, and we're engaging in, like, sort of, we summarize the piece together, we think through potential limitations, or what we would have seen, and I was asking the same questions. And so I thought, well, let's go ahead and share these questions that might be useful for folks, and start to be able to ground our theory that can stay really abstract, into something concrete, to be able to see the stakes. The question
Yeah.
always, for me, is like, what are the stakes when I read something?
Yeah. And I mean, it was one of those things too, like, cause me, I'm not deep into decolonial theory. As I mentioned, like because it is so, it is one of those things like abolition, I would put in the same kind of camp, not camp, but like in the same, that it is a space for people who are in the academy who want to do some kind of radical work to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do this within a framework of abolition. And that's allowed essentially within the academy. Whereas if you were just like, hey, I'm going to do a Marxist Leninist Maoist analysis of X, Y, and Z, the academy doesn't really want you to do to do that, quite frankly, right? And so people operate within these kind of schools in some ways, but they are they become and I'll use abolition as an example because I think it's a good one. They become very broad, right? And so you get people within it that are just liberals. You get people in it that have like kind of social democratic politics and thought. You get people who are like small c, like kind of communist or anarchist folks for sure. And then less, I would say, do you get people who are kind of within a Marxist Leninist side of things. Although Ruthie Wilson Gilmore has like a pretty good background in historical materialism and Marxism and all of that. So like she would be an example of somebody. I mean, even I know that there's a lot of critiques and disagreements with Angela Davis, rightfully so, especially around presidential nominations and things like this. But like she also comes out of a Marxist Leninist tradition too, in certain ways, as well as her own training with Marcuse and stuff like that. But um, so it is one of those things where it's like there there is less, my perception as an outsider is that there's less space for people to operate within the academy as just a Marxist or a Marxist Leninist or a Maoist, and there's a little bit more space to fit within some of these other camps, but then you have to deal with all the contradictions within these camps and all of the broadness and um kind of, it's unified in a certain way, but it's also very, there's a tremendous variety within it as well. That's just my thought on that. So let's pull up your questions here. All right. So I thought this would be useful for people who haven't read the piece. Yes, if you want to you could just walk us through these questions a little bit, and maybe say a little bit about them.
Sure. So I'm going to start with the sentence before. So I offer 8 questions to clarify what we mean when we talk about decolonial theory or decoloniality. So first, what is the goal, if there is one? I'm just going to read through them, and then we can sort of tease them out. Second, what is the political program to get there? Third, why is this term, the term of decoloniality or coloniality? And we could also ask this for why is anti-colonial, world making, post-colonial, whatever, the preferred term. Fourth, who are the social actor or the social actors or classes or groups, however we want to quantify this, to give this political program substance? Are there political parties present? Are the social movements present? If so, what are the possible configurations of coalitions? And on what basis is this unity? Fifth, in what way are the logics of coloniality present? Sixth, who or what is the enemy or the contradiction? Seventh, how does this theory interact with the historical unfolding of social formations and with concurrent configurations of accumulation on a world scale? And this question is aiming to highlight the relationship between theory and US-led imperialism. Eighth, how can we make these relations plain in ways that our children can understand? And then these questions are not meant to be applied mechanically, nor do I suggest that they're the only ones that are worth asking. They're just aimed at bringing into view the real social relations that can get hidden behind these abstract universals. Whether it's decoloniality, whether it's coloniality, whether it's anti-colonial, whether it's post-colonial, whether it's Marxist, I take your pick of whatever, insert theory here. I think these questions can start to get us to being more concrete in getting to the stakes of whatever the topic is at hand. And in the piece, I look at 4 different excerpts. If we have time, maybe we can do some of them. and begin to then tease out some of where the questions where organically for me, the questions emerged. I'd read a paragraph and be like, well, okay, but what's the goal here about it? Or what's the political program? Or, okay, this is really dense. What did you mean by this? How can we explain this in a way that our children can understand? The ones that are going to be most affected by the exploitation of the coloniality of the matrix of coloniality, or the colonial matrix of power. So those were the questions. Those were how they developed. And yeah, I think the ways that they become most clear is by applying it to specific excerpts, I think. But if there's a specific one that sticks out to you, we can begin to unpack it more and think through it together.
Yeah, let's pull up some of the passages that you're looking at and the questions with them. So hang on.
I will say out of the four, I think the fourth one is the most instructive, but if we have time to do all four, we can just make our way through them. But I wanted to, for those that might be heading out, to stay along for the fourth one at least.
We could start with the fourth one if it doesn't really matter too much the order.
No, it doesn't. They were arbitrarily picked.
All right. All right. So let's talk about this one. All right. So I'll read it. So in 2020, this is the kind of preamble that you write. Walter Mignolo responded to some questions about decoloniality in response to how decoloniality can address massive wealth inequality, environmental destruction, and what he calls the global power structure. Mignolo writes, this is the quote, At the same time, we, by engaging decoloniality, shall not forget our limits in a world dominated by trillions of dollars devoted to the arms race, corporations extracting whatever they can from Earth without looking at the consequences, trillions of dollars going to military arms race marketing for decoloniality to tear down, quote, the global power structure. It would be necessary to build an economic, military, and political structure that can overwhelm de-Westernization and re-Westernization. But at that point, it won't be decolonial anymore. What decoloniality could do is to tear down the modern colonial structures of knowledge that today sustains the political forces of de-Westernization and re-Westernization competing for natural resources, military power, and political influence. So I find that to be quite a circular piece of writing, but go ahead.
Right. And of course, not all decolonial theorists would uphold this. This is just the excerpt from this interview. But also one of the clearer moments where you get sort of a clear position. And so in the piece, I have 4 comments. Let me just think about them. I don't want to just read it to you all since we have time to just share. So first thing that comes to mind is the quote, the global power structure. Here we have the removal of the capitalist world system has disappeared. And it's sort of floating ahistorically, ahistorically as a nebulous sort of Western imperial design, which gets us to question 6, which is about, I think, who is the enemy? I didn't put the name of the question. Let's see, question 6. Yeah, who or what is the enemy or the contradiction? Second, I'm pointing out the point about being clear on what de-Westernization refers to and what re-Westernization will refer to. So de-Westernization referring to anti-systemic movements in the global South. I named the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, but that's because I talk about it in an earlier excerpt. We could also talk about the axis of resistance in general. We could probably talk about less, I don't know. I don't even know if I would call it like controversial, but like a more crystal clear example of an oppressed like nation that is that is combating U.S.-led imperialism, or and then re-Westernization would refer to movements and class formations that are aligned with U.S.-led imperialism. And so the quote where he says, it would be necessary to build an economic, military, and political power structure that can overwhelm de-Westernization and re-Westernization But at that point, if you were to build that power to actually materially change things, it would no longer be decolonial, which to me silos the project of decoloniality to things that aren't affecting materially, that aren't affecting the problems of mass wealth inequality, environmental destruction, etc., and silos the realm of emancipatory politics in the epistemic or in the cultural. Now, I'm not saying that all decolonial theory is like this, etc. I'm just pointing out that according to Walter Mignolo, it would no longer actually be decolonial. So
Yeah, I
rather
think
than
that's
being, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say it's an interesting point too, because tomorrow we're going to be talking about Lacerdo's Western Marxism, and I just finished this, and like this is one of his critiques about Western Marxism too, of basically, it becomes a project, and obviously this is based on how he defines it and who he's looking at as Western Marxists within it, etc. It's not like every Marxist that's within the West necessarily, right? But when he's looking at this project, he's like, it becomes a politics only of dissent, right? And so once a socialist project, achieves, whether, I mean, I know that as you from a Maoist perspective, you'd think more about social forces, etc., and not necessarily like the state as being well, I don't know, I don't want to put that on you, but there's like some people who are like, a state can't be socialist, right? It's more about like what's going on within the society, etc. But that basically his point, right, is that like once a socialist or a communist party seizes the state in any setting, that then sort of automatically through Western Marxism, then it becomes something that needs to be resisted, right? And so it becomes a sort of, it's always a politics of dissent, even if socialists and socialist party, communist party it is actually kind of driving things within the society, right? um and I think that's sort of, I see a similar problem within this piece of like, it's decolonial up into the point of then when it has a possibility of actually challenging the structures of imperialism and colonization. And then at that point, it's no longer decolonial. Now, does that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, I guess, but it just is an interesting sort of move within the theory.
I think I was most surprised by this when I was in the Philippines, or not most surprised, but it was uh, most stark for me when I was in the Philippines this summer. Um, I was at a zine fest, and to see the presence of the ND movement there were National Democratic Movement organizations, peasant organizations that were like tabling. And I'm so used to, and I'm speaking to what you were saying about dissent being sort of like the only politic, which also was my like foray into political consciousness, was also this sort of lifestyle anarchist understanding of sort of just dissent, be ungovernable, that sort of thing. But being there in the US, in America with 3Ks, there's always like the zine fests are typically, not always, but like are heavily anarchist, anti-fascist. A lot of like zines in general has that a rich tradition there. But to see a communist party active and like that being almost the major representation at the zine fest was really surprising to me, and cool to see like how organized the left can be. And I think these things depend on where you are. The question of the state, the question of whether it's, whether you call it socialist or not, or communist or not. I think nowadays I don't really care what you call it. Think of like Prenti, where he talks about like, call it a lampshade. I don't care. What matters to me is like, what are the social relations? How are people living? But yeah, I think I'll leave it there on that regard. That it just depends on where you are, and so countries that are neo-colonial or even semi-feudal, like the Philippines, you need to be able to enact policies to be able to upend the policies that are detrimental to the broad masses of people.
Right. Um, was there, sorry, I cut you off. Was there anything else in that section that we didn't address yet? Let's see. Oh, let's see. How do I do that? Oh, there we go.
I mean, the only other part
Um,
was that, to me, it was a recapitulation of Thatcher's Tina, that there's no alternative, that's wrapped in decolonial guise, that there's, that as soon as we were able to enact something, it's now no longer decolonial, because what decolonial is about is uh, tearing down the structure of knowledge. And
got it.
then
Yeah.
fourth, I think, which is really, really important, actually, and I only gets one sentence, and I have to thank Nate, who's the co-host of the podcast that we started, that the clearest way to rupture the modern colonial structure of knowledge, or the structure of knowledge, or I think Wallerstein calls it the geoculture of knowledge, is through praxis. And we see this with Alexa Flood and the last year of heroic resistance and heroic the prison break on October 7th. And you can see all the time people posting like, I was always pro-Palestine, but never was it so clear to me the importance of armed struggle, the importance of resistance, the importance of the national liberation project. So, and more so than anything that's coming out of that I'm going to be writing, or that's going to be coming out of the academia, whether it's decolonial, whether it's Marxist, whatever.
It's certainly more important than anything that I'm doing, for sure. And I mean, I encourage the people actually, honestly, often, like, one of the most important things you can do right now, I think, is to contribute to, I keep shouting them out, but like projects like the Samir Project, which is like literally funding tents, food, and water to people in northern Gaza as the Zionist entity is trying to ethnically cleanse them out of northern Gaza, right? And and so yeah, I mean, it's actually it's been a increasing frustration, I think, for those of us who are in America with 3Ks, to yeah, just to find how little force we are able to enact upon our existing system in order to be some kind of point of um, material solidarity to people in Palestine, in Lebanon, and so on. And even more so, that the inverse of that for me is to say that, what Ansar Allah is doing, what Hezbollah has been doing, what Hamas has been doing, even what Iran has done, right? It is like way beyond what the PMU, different forces in Iraq, like way beyond what any of us in the West are able to do. And it doesn't really matter whether we agree with them on a level of ideas or theory. What matters is that they are the material forces that are able to actually, that are actually intervening in a way and risking their lives to do so, and their families and everything. So, yeah, I hear you in terms of the kind of the humility which those of us who engage in media work, intellectual work, and academic work right now need to have, I think, in the face of all of this. Let's go to another excerpt from it. So, which one should we go to next?
Let's just go ahead and do one, and we can work our way, if we have time, through them, but we can just
Yep.
feel it out.
Yep. All right, cool. All right. So I can read this one again. So the concept of coloniality opened up two trajectories at once. On the one hand, it brought into light the darker side of modernity, and on the other hand, it mutated decolonization into decoloniality and into decolonial thinking. It means that paradoxically, decolonization during the Cold War was still articulated in terms and sensibility of modern thinking. It aimed at changing the contents rather than the principles in which modernity coloniality was established. So yeah, it's an interesting passage. Break that down a little bit.
Sure. To me, what is the central part and why I picked it is the last sentence about decolonization, the era of decolonization during the Cold War, um, and what it means to be articulated in terms and the sensibility of modernity, or the darker side of modernity, uh, aiming to change the contents rather than the principles in which modernity / coloniality, which are mutually constitutive for Mignolo, was established. And so I began asking that this period of national liberation struggles, if it's articulated in these terms of struggle, or articulated as the sensibilities of modernity, what is the goal of decolonial thinking for decolonizing movements? Which gets us to question one: what is the goal? Concretely, what would changing the principles in which modernity or coloniality was established look like, as opposed to the content itself? So let's be able to articulate this in ways that our children can understand. Because right now, and I think this is partly why it has such a long staying power, decoloniality, is that how abstract it remains. Like, what do we mean concretely by changing the terms but not the content? Let's flesh that out. And I don't have answers. But what I offer, though, is that we can ground our questions or our theories within history by looking at specific examples. So earlier I mentioned in passing the FLN in Algeria and during French settler colonialism. But in the piece, I then turned to the PIGC in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And there's this quote from Amilcar Cabral that brings out the colonial situation really starkly. I don't know if would you mind reading that, Jared? It's at the bottom of page 4 to the top of page 5. Yeah.
Is it the lack of protein?
The lack of protein. Yes.
Yeah.
This is from a speech.
From a speech from Amilcar Cabral. And this is one of the things I do want to just say something quickly to some conversation I'm seeing in the chat, because one of the things I'm seeing is people suggesting that you don't cite any indigenous theorists, or that, and it's like, again, there's a distinction between coloniality and colonialism, and as well as a distinction between decoloniality and indigeneity that I think are important here. And Amilcar Cabral is certainly, an indigenous theorist of Cape Verde, right? So, I think that, anyway, I just wanted to say that to folks. But so Cabral says, quote, "The lack of protein and many basic foods holds back the development of our people. In some regions, there has been an 80% mortality rate, or infant mortality rate. Throughout the golden age of Portuguese colonialism, we had only 2 hospitals with a total of 300 beds in the whole country, and only 18 doctors, 12 of them in Bissau. As for schools, there were only 45 of them, and they were Catholic missionary schools, only teaching the catechism. There were 11 official schools for assimilado children. For folks who don't know, yeah, it's like a class system, but assimilado is like the kind of those who are working in colonial management, I believe. But there were no secondary schools at all in Guinea-Bissau until 1959. Now there is one. There were only 2,000 children in schools throughout the country, and you can imagine the kind of teaching. It was a deliberate decision to prevent the development of our people, just as they did in Angola, Mozambique, and other countries," end quote. So, yeah.
Right, thank you. So I include that quote to then ask the question, what would a decolonial option look like for Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde under Portuguese rule? Who are the social actors? And so then we can work through these questions when we look at a specific, what would have looked like for the PIGC to change the principles in which modernity coloniality was established, and not the content of the colonial situation. If your theory is not interested in these questions, who are the social actors that are doing it? What is the enemy and the contradiction? How does this theory of decoloniality interact with the historic unfolding of imperialism on a world scale? What way is it decolonial? And then if it is argued to be decolonial, then what does it say about decoloniality as a concept and really its limitations for decolonization or from the colonial, or particularly from or for the colonial difference? And this is, once again, I'm not reading the chat, so I don't see the conversation happening, but I do want to say this isn't saying that decolonial theory isn't interested in it, but it does not come up in the piece at any point.
100%. Yeah. And It did actually end up banning one person, mainly because they repeatedly misgendered you after being told not to do that. But anyway, um, but there's this is one of the things actually I do want to say quickly about this piece and about engaging around this that is challenging, right? Because we're like, I mean, there's even that piece that I think Taiwo wrote called "Against Decolonization," and it's like even when you create a phrase like that, like I haven't actually read that, and some people read it. Like actually, it has a lot of good points that he brings up, but like we are not against decolonization, nor are we, yeah, even against a lot of the different things that decoloniality is asking people to do, right? It's just sort of a question of like, I actually think that my issue is the sort of level of confusion too that then comes into the play of like, what are we talking about? Like, are we talking about decolonization? Are we talking about national liberation? Are we talking about taking state power and then what we will do with our institutions when we take state power? Are we talking about, and so I think that it gets to a point where people will say, well, okay, you're against this, it's you're being anti-indigenous or you're being pro-colonialism, which like anybody who has watched our work over the last 7 years, I would hope would understand, like if there's one consistent principle that we've tried to always uphold, it has been anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and being opposed to these things. But I do think that there are ways, and again, it's not just within decolonial theory that this happens, that things can get very muddy within the academy, and suddenly you're reading stuff and you're not really clear anymore of like what is the project here, and so yeah, I mean, anyway, I just wanted to say that because, yeah, anyway,
There's a great
um,
essay that I would point people towards. It's an older essay from Barbara Smith called "The Race for Theory," written in the 70s or 80s, and probably the 80s. And I think it captures partly the issue that at hand, which is the politics of knowledge production. And we're always chasing to have a new neologism or a new theory, and you're rewarded when it's really dense because then you can spend your time articulating. You have several book deals to be able to write out what you were getting at, what you meant by it. But what does this mean for how is this going to for a child in Guinea-Bissau or Cape Verde or the Philippines or where, and to insert your wherever you want. And so that's partly it. So the essay is called "The Race for Theory." I highly it's not long. It's like 5 pages.
appreciate it so much. All right. um, let's do excerpt 2.
Cool. Are you fine reading? I like this
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
I don't
format.
mind. I don't mind reading it. I know it's
Just
kind of
that way
like
people can
small,
hear
honestly.
other people's
Yeah, yeah.
other voices.
All right, so this is another excerpt. If you expect decoloniality today to be a remake of decolonization during the Cold War, you would be deceived by my argument. We are no longer in the Cold War. The Cold War was driven by the confrontation of liberal capitalism with state communism. No longer. Decolonization was successful in sending the colonizer home, but it was a failure, for it ended up creating nation states that remained within the management of CMP, colonial matrix of power. Even if imperial settlers were no longer in the terrain, the defeat of capitalism was intended several times in the name of Marxism, and several times it failed because Marxism remained within the frame of the colonial matrix of power. It opposed the content, but did not question the terms, assumptions, principles, regulations of the type of knowledge within capitalism, so the type of knowledge within which capitalism would not exist.
Great. And so I mean, there's so much here that we could spend time unpacking. Um, this comes back to the problematic earlier of once struggle gets to a certain terrain, new contradictions arise. And so how do we interpret these contradictions, and what is the what is the cause of the contradiction? And so for Mignolo, the failure of the Marxist project of national liberation movements was because it remained within the colonial matrix of power and assuming the content but not questioning the terms. And I'm assuming that has to do with the state, the question of taking state power, of utilizing the state as a as a tool for liberation. And that's my read of what he's getting at, but back to not being clear and unpacking what you mean. So that's just my most charitable reading that I can think of. And so then the question becomes, uh, then the question turns to the national question and the question of the state and the question of how imperialism unfolds on a world scale and what can social formations, what can so-called underdeveloped countries do to be able to change these terms and change these conditions. And so I look at the Philippines, which what I'm most familiar with as my mother country, where the Philippines is still a semi-feudal country. Most people are still living in the provinces. You have several big cities, and a lot of people are trying to move to the big cities because life in the province is beautiful but hard, and it's difficult to survive. You have subsistence. You can survive with some form of subsistence farming, but then a lot of it is monocultural, like you're working for an agribusiness that legally owns the land, but like you technically own it through this sort of system. Within the sort of the agrarian laws, you're only able to have 5 hectares, but basically the people own the land on paper, but the agribusiness contracts with you and can tells you what you can grow and owns the product before it's even grown, 10 years out. And so whether we call it a Cold War, whether you call a state socialist is irrelevant to me. Whether we call it a Cold War is also irrelevant to me. There are still vast regions in the global South that are underdeveloped, that are locked into dependence, and that didn't go away at the end of the so-called Cold War. And so that's the first thing to say. And looking at the Philippines specifically, I think if we get even more concrete, we can look at like a specific commodity that I work on, rice. The Philippines is the #1 rice exporter in the world, but also the 8th largest importer of rice. So you have this disarticulated situation where clearly there's not an issue of being able to produce. The conditions are ripe for growing lots of rice. And if you know any Filipinos, like every meal like has a lot of rice. You have like maybe a little bit of meat or a little bit of vegetables, and then no matter how poor you are, as long as you have a cup of rice with a little bit of veggies, and you have a full meal, or at least a full tummy. But you have the situation though where we're able to grow the rice, but because of these agreements, because of the ways that the Philippines, the longer history of colonization under Spanish, under the US, there's a short history under Japan, back under the US, and then a level of actual not independence, but a level of subservience or dependent development under the aegis of the US-led imperialism. You have the situation where we're importing so much rice, so many crops that we're actually growing, and we're exporting more than we're consuming for ourselves. And this is something that the so-called first world knows and does, where they protect their industries to be able to pay their workers in a way that they can reproduce themselves, where social reproduction is subsidized by the state in that sort of way, where countries in the global South aren't able to do that as easily. And if they are, it requires movements to be able to push people in power, and movements that will back the government that is trying to make these changes. But at this point, within at least how Mignolo is approaching, this isn't even a conversation. It's immediately within the colonial matrix of power. If I'm interpreting him correct, that the problem of Marxism was that it remained within this frame. And so this is partly the critique, and then we can get into the questions of how do you explain this to our children affected by these policies? The question of who is going to be the social force that's able to enact it. And so I end the section looking at back to a whole host of national liberation movements, Frelimo in Mozambique, the PIGC in Guinea-Bissau, the MPLA in Angola. I was trying to think about the African continent since the journal was for Review of African Political Economy, but I included the NPA and also the PFLP and the DFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And the question, I think the important question that has to be asked is, let me find where it is. What would it mean to question the terms, the assumptions, the principles, the regulations of the type of knowledge within which capitalism would not exist in the case of these movements? And what sort of political program does this call for? And what kind of political program does decoloniality call for? So those are the questions I think should be asked. And this doesn't mean that you couldn't ask it while engaging within decolonial literature. And what you were talking about with academia, I think people that are working within decoloniality, and I think in some ways I work within decoloniality, even though I'm critiquing, because I think that the conversation should be had, and just not saying, well, people over here are doing this, and I'm gonna stay siloed in my little bubble.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, yes, it's funny to me because it's also I don't think of critique as a negative project, and I don't look at what you're doing in the piece as I don't look at it as taking away from anything other. I mean, a lot of what I see the essay, or the paper doing is saying is actually challenging academic theory in a way that I think all academic theory should be challenged, which is to say, okay, some of this is cool. Like, what do we do with it? How can we put it to use? And sometimes when you some of those questions, we don't always like the answers that we get to some of those questions because it becomes very unclear, or it also becomes clear that and I'm not saying this is the case of any individual here, but in many cases, that's not their project, actually. Like, they're not actually thinking about creating, and I'm not, I think decoloniality is a little bit different because I think they are, in certain ways, trying to think about how do we get past some of these problems that we have encountered that, and they might have different answers to those questions than we do too, right? But I think it's productive for me, you know, I think critique is a productive thing, not just like I'm just tearing it down just to tear this all down, right? It's to actually say, okay, what can we do with this? So all right, so the last one I'll go ahead
Very
and
much. I just
read.
want to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I like to say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so decolonial thinking does not appear yet. This is Mignolo again. Not even in the most extreme leftist publications. And the reason is that decolonial thinking is not leftist, but rather another thing entirely. It is a delinking from the modern political episteme, articulated as right, center, and left. It is an opening towards another thing on the march, searching for itself in the difference. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So here, I might just read what I write because it's like 2 sentences, and then maybe I'll expound. So by placing decoloniality above so-called modernity's articulations of right, center, and left, decolonial theorists have disarticulated or delinked modernity from colonialism, from neocolonialism, and from imperialism. And rejecting the political episteme articulated as right, center, and left, decolonial thinking has effectively abandoned an analysis of imperialism, a coherent political program that could challenge it, and a historical subject that's tasked with preventing immiseration, which has a class backing. I think this is crucial for me, which has a class backing that's historically and socially articulated and actualized as from the right. It is a predicate without a subject. meaning this is when you think like a sentence. I want to expound on this because it's a pregnant sentence that is a predicate without a subject. You think of a sentence, you have the subject itself, you have the predicate, which is here you are in grammar class, which is what the subject is doing, everything else that follows it. And so this is something happening, but without any sort of subject that's doing it. It's sort of ahistorical. And so this school of thought renders imperialism and therefore history unintelligible. And it's the logical conclusion of theories that are built on abstract universals. And I will say, though, I do know that coloniality or decolonial thinking, and Mignolo talks about this, and I talk about it in the piece, starts in the long 20th century. Starts with the colonization of the Americas. And he says, I don't know if I mentioned it in the piece, I think I do, that decoloniality is not a postmodern project that is like afraid of universal, like big narratives. And the narrative that that Mignolo is drawing on is this long 16th century, the colonization of Americas, starting this project of modernity that's embedded, the darker side of modernity that's embedded in coloniality. And so, and my critique of that is that it remains so far abstract. Ironically, it's like another totalizing narrative that needs to get drawn back into what are the specific concrete contradictions that are affecting a specific social formation. And that's why I think the social formation is a useful analytic, because we're able to look at domination, integration, the ways that countries, regions are unevenly integrated, and the amount of maneuvering room that a specific region or movement, social movement, has to be able to actually challenge imperialism. And here, though, according to Mignolo, the way he's approaching decoloniality thinking is that it's not concerned, it's with sort of the ideas on whether it's being on the left or the right. But my problem with that, though, is that immiseration, class backing, US imperialism has a class backing which is articulated, which has a filled by a social substance within of people on the right, policies on the right. And I guess in America with 3K is also on the so-called democratic left as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have, and maybe this also speaks to some of the problems, and also why I think in the United States, for instance, indigenous critique is very important, is because there's also everything is kind of a settler right wing political formation to some degree. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not like we have like the Democratic Party, right? Is not something that we could ever point to and say that this is meaningfully left in the way that I certainly would think of something being meaningfully left, which would at the very least be, I mean, to me, anti-capitalism is sort of like a basic barometer of whether something is left or right. Obviously, there's the whole debate around social democracy and things like that, but we don't even have like a social democratic leaning party in the United States. We have, anyway. So yeah, I mean, it's such a, it's like, and the whole structure of the United States is built as a settler colonial and imperial project, right? And so it's like anything that is defending, reinforcing that structure is certainly a problem in one form or another, for obviously for indigenous people, but also for the whole planet and and the world, in I think both of our perspectives. And so yeah, I mean, it's anyway, I don't mean to, but so I'm open to questions for folks. So this is one. So somebody asked, how is global historical materialism avoid the abstract universals critiqued in the paper, even when specific local examples it relies on, or universalizing tropes from what I read? So maybe, yeah, say a little bit about, I know that you cite Samir Amin. This is someone you're thinking with, as well as like Ali Kadri and others. And so talk a little bit about thinking, I mean, one, how these questions sort of derive for you from a global historical materialist critique, but also like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think maybe looking at the social formation would be helpful here. Because beyond, we really, in this like conversation, we've been discussing the 8 questions, but the other part of the piece that I was thinking through, and I'm still thinking through, is a potential unit of analysis to be thinking about, to ground our theory in, to be able to avoid these abstract universals. I don't know if we can really avoid abstract universals, and the reason being, imperialism operates on a world scale, and so we have to think on the scale of the world in many ways. And partly that's why I'm in the program that I'm in global studies, to be able to think about things that are localized, called the local global continuum, things that are localized and how they have global ramifications. We look at, I don't know, we go back to banana. We look at a banana and it's like, there's an entire, I wish I had a banana with me to, as like a prop, but we have an entire realm of social relations embedded in this banana, histories of domination, etc. And so even when I don't know if we can avoid it within global historical materialism, but what we can do, and I think this is the clearest answer I can give, is we can start to then ask some of these questions. And it doesn't have to be these 8 questions, but to be able to start getting crisper and clearer and more concrete on where the contradictions are, on what is the political program if there is one, and if there's not, why? What are the limitations of choosing one course of action? I don't think there's any course of action that's perfect, but we have a historical task. We don't get to choose our where we end up in history, but we have a historic task to make a decision and act. And so those are some of the thoughts I have with it. But I think by asking concrete questions, we're able to ground our theory in ways that are more legible than if we just leave it in the abstract. And that's actually some critiques that I have of the tradition that I work out of, which is world systems theory, is like we think about the world system and the unit of analysis can be sort of nebulous. We can talk about the core and the periphery. Sometimes that means a region. Sometimes that means a mode of production. It means different things to different people. And so you don't exactly know what an author is thinking through or a theorist is thinking through unless they name it, which is another thing. I think that theorists in general should be naming their position, naming their what they're theorizing, where their obviously their standpoint and their position. Because I think the decolonial critique and the feminist critique is really correct. That there's not an unbiased, God-centered. This is Enrique Dussel. There's not this God-centered Cartesian, I think therefore I am, but we're embedded in all of these levels. And so I think one thing that historical materialists should be doing is thinking through their position and naming not just their positionality, but their position as well and where they stand on it, because none of us are unbiased. So there's that. And I think the last thing I'll say is on the social formation, within my field, we talk, and even within geography as well, we talk about decentering the nation state or critiquing what's called methodological nationalism. The idea that, which is also partly why I ran from political science, it's a very state-centric field. What is the privileged sort of domain of inquiry? It's the state. And there's a lot of reasons for this, like the data. It's like we have a lot of data that's bounded by the state. But rarely, so we have this negative critique of saying like, we're going to not do methodological nationalism, we're going to decenter, we're not going to do the nation state, but rarely is there ever offered up an alternative. World systems theory will say the world system itself. That's a very broad, and there's, I think Christopher Chase Dunn does some interesting work thinking about not just the modern capitalist world system, but then what would a socialist world system look like? I don't know of many other people that have been doing work like that. But I'm offering up potentially the social formation, which was used by Marx, picked up by Samir Amin. Other theorists have also used it. And the most like concrete way I could describe it, let's just look at Samir Amin really quickly. So in Unequal Development, which was his first book, he writes, social formations are thus concrete, organized structures that are marked by a dominant mode of production and the articulation around this of a complex group of modes of production that are subordinate to it. And what's important here is this, this relationship between dominant modes of productions and subordinated modes that are linked. Elsewhere, he talks about how they're linked by long distance trade. So by taking the social formation as our unit of analysis, it forces us to think about these interrelations and interdependencies. It forces us to think about what it could be called peripheral social formations, or what we can usually just call the third world or underdeveloped regions. I think peripheral social formations captures it a little bit better versus core social formations. And it also allows us to think about specific class alliances that can be articulated even within the same nation itself, that can get washed over. And this is like Andre Frank talks about the regional development of underdevelopment within the territoriality of one state. So like in the US, obviously we can think of indigenous nations, oppressed nations within. We can look at New York City, and like obviously someone on Wall Street compared to like the barista that makes their coffee in the morning are living entirely different life worlds, all within the same area. And so we're able to, by using social formation, we're able to start thinking about, it centers this sort of uneven connection, and I guess you can say what Trotsky called the uneven and combined development. So that's a thing that I think we should be thinking about. There's some things that we have to think through with it, but I think it's a way that global historical materialism has already used to do that. It sort of fell by the wayside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. So this was a correction earlier. Thank you, Joshua. So it was Barbara Christian, not Barbara Smith. And what was the piece again's name that you
The Race
mentioned?
for Theory.
Race for Theory. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
thank you, Josh.
thanks for
Yeah, I was
that
like, is it Barbara
correction, Joshua.
Christian Smith? But yeah, Barbara Christian.
Yeah. And then I don't know if this was in response directly to what we were saying or to stuff that was going on in the chat, but I just hope that people are clear. We're not trying to dismiss entire schools of thought. We are saying that as we read these different things, like these are questions that are useful to ask, to critique these theories, also to be able to, sharpen them, to see if there's a real, and yeah, I mean, anyway, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but the critique of entire schools of thought, or
I mean, I think we've said
dismissing.
it several times. This isn't a critique of decoloniality as a school of thought, as writ large. This is a specific articulation of decoloniality that gets assigned a lot, that I've in 3 different classes had assigned to me and required courses. And butting up against it over and over, these questions sort of developed. So yeah, decoloniality is important. It has a lot of important things to say. And I think critique is not as you were saying earlier, isn't a negative thing. And this isn't a broad sweep critique of the project of decoloniality, but it's to say, what are we talking about when we talk about decoloniality, and what are the contradictions?
So this is a good question. I think shouldn't decolonial theory be created from oppressed communities? I would say from also organizations and parties and so on, but instead of from within academia, which are colonial institutions. I mean, obviously this is an important contradiction that you're citing here, Ricardo.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, the academy is, one of my favorite Fred Moten isms is something along the lines of the academy is not for the proliferation of thought, it is for the regulation of thought, and just, I thought that was always a useful, and he was like, even in the beginning, like even in Europe in the beginning, like that was the point, was to regulate ideas, not to like generate, wild, creative, emancipatory thinking. And that doesn't mean that people, and we can get, this will be a good follow up because somebody asked you, what does being a guerrilla intellectual mean to you? You mentioned this on the podcast. Few people have cited the podcast, so shout out to you both for that. But hear more on this, given that Ashwin here is also in academia.
I think Nate called me a guerrilla intellectual. I didn't call myself one. From my understanding, the phrase comes from Walter Rodney. or at least that's how I've heard it. And I don't know if I'd call myself. I aspire to be a guerrilla intellectual. I don't. I think what it could mean. Oh, so I don't roll my eyes at, like, it's very common to say I'm a scholar activist, and it's become yeah. So I take that back. I don't roll my eyes at it, but I think it's become a phrase that is used for everyone, and it's become stretched so much. It's like such a big tent that, like, you could be a DEI person, which is more or less counterinsurgency, and be a scholar activist. You can be someone within, I don't know, running for the Democratic Party and say you're a scholar activist or whatever. And I'm sure there are. And so, in one sense, like, calling yourself an intellectual or a guerrilla intellectual is a way of differentiating and saying, actually, more than a scholar activist, I'm a guerrilla intellectual. And I think there is a commitment to producing for communities that are engaged in national liberation projects that include armed struggle and guerrilla warfare and protracted people's wars and these sorts of projects. So that's what I would describe it as. But also, I just want to clear that I didn't call myself a guerrilla intellectual. Yeah.
A good person that has thought about this a lot, written about it, and also talked about it on their podcast is Musa Springer too. Shout out to Musa, and a couple of episodes that we've done with them on Walter Rodney, especially the first, I think we've done like maybe 3 or whatever, like they get into it a little bit more in terms of what Walter meant by it. One of the things that I remember Musa saying at one point, because Musa kind of bristles at the way that it gets used now kind of in the academy, is that from Musa's perspective, Walter Rodney did not mean that this person necessarily was an academic. Like it really wasn't like um it was more about somebody who's, the term organic intellectual often sometimes gets thrown out about it, but somebody who, is putting knowledge in service of movements. And obviously Rodney did work in a marginalized, often threatened, often deported, and so on relationship with the academy in different parts of the world. Um, but also, a lot of Walter Rodney's work is not, I mean, he has some pieces that are more, it's all very rigorous, but like, there's like some of the books, there's not a lot of citations. There's, like, and so, I think Walter Rodney also was very much thinking about a lot of the stuff that's captured as speeches, it's lectures, it's, there's the book Groundings with My Brothers, which I think would be a good example for people who want an example of what does a guerrilla intellectual, like that is sort of like talks that he created that he would give to people in Jamaica during like a revolutionary period to try to help explain things and so on. And so yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I think, what I see of as the aspiration around it. And I think I'm actually a little bit worried sometimes that people um are taking it on now to mean sort of this, what they mean by scholar activist, which is like you can be a dope scholar activist too. It's just that it, again, like abolition, you could also just be a liberal, and like this is the thing that you're using too. So, you know, um let's see. So Ricardo, appreciate it, and I'm gonna check this out. Listen to Post Scarcity Pod and Decolonized Buffalo for an in-depth understanding of decolonial theory and material conditions within North America. We'll put 3Ks on it for Joma. But yeah, I mean, and again, like I anybody who watches, I mean, for instance, Laura Shihai is a decolonial psychologist, and this is the work that she does. Stephen Shihai as well. Like, and so it is not to say that as millennials, like we're suddenly canceling everybody who puts decolonial on something, right? And I would be interested. I'll look forward to talking to her a little bit about her thoughts on this piece. And I know Stephen actually recently, I don't know if it's published yet, but he had sent me a piece he wrote on decolonial theory himself, thinking about like what are the things from this that we need to keep and defend, and what are the things that are actually not, that useful or are hindering us. And I think that's also an important project as well, because it is what we're not doing here is like a blanket. I mean, we've said, like you said, we've said it many times, but recognizing that we can be critical, and we can look within it and say there are interventions, because this is a debate I've also had with people who have critiqued me for platforming of certain feminist things. And it's like, look, I don't I don't organize or spend all of my time within a school of thought of feminism, even if it's Marxist feminism or decolonial feminism or whatever. However, there are many key intellectual interventions that I wouldn't have, and that I wouldn't be able to really understand and make sense of without that work. And so, it's not for me a thing of like, oh, I'm gonna then, so we try on millennials to be fairly open into bringing people in from a kind of wide anti-capitalist, non-sectarian perspective. But there are going to be disagreements, and that's okay too. I think it's actually really good and healthy, and that's something that we should also foster. I think this is a good point too. There are no real communist organization within the US. I mean, that is an opinion, but yes. But while simultaneously, settler orgs, regardless of their political standing, can't be the vanguard in a decolonial movement. And I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things is like this piece is approaching the question from Africa. It's a piece written in Review of African Political Economy, is the journal. Um, it, it would be a different piece too if the point of analysis for the whole piece was North American. So I don't know if you want to say anything with regard to that, but I know, like, for folks who have listened to the pod, like, you take a third worldist, kind of position. So yeah.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. Is the piece is centered in thinking about the African continent, and so purposely deprovincializing America with three Ks. I think this is where a lot of where people are coming from with the piece, and a lot of people approach decoloniality, thinking about the so-called American with three Ks continent and context, and all the nations within. So it's understandable. But the reason why that happened is why it was written the way it was. It's because it was written thinking about the African continent. And so that, I think that's the main point in that regard. As far as the third worldist perspective, Nate and I are going to be discussing next week Third Worlds Within, which there was a book recently that came out, but to think about within the so-called United States, to thinking about these oppressed nations and various theories about oppressed nations within. And so there'll be more on that, much more on that then. And so I think I'll leave it there and tell people go listen to that episode to hear about thoughts about a third worldist perspective on oppressed nations within the U.S. And to comment though, I mean, I don't know if I would say there's any real communist party in the U.S. Like that, neither here nor there. I don't really disagree with that, but also, and I also will say I totally agree. It can't be led by, and it won't. A revolutionary rupture in the U.S. will not be led by settler vanguardist formations. It'll be oppressed communities and white people and various articulations of settlers will have a responsibility to work under and work alongside. But it'll be led by oppressed nations within, if there ever is a revolutionary rupture, which we're working towards. So.
Right. If we can get there, absolutely. So this was a different question. I mean, it's not too related to peace, but your thoughts on China in the third world global south regarding sovereign development or somehow alleviating the conditions of underdevelopment? I know this gets very complicated when we talk about the Philippines, but yeah.
Yeah. It's a huge question. We could
yeah,
unpack this for hours.
We're not going to do it in 2 minutes. Yeah.
But what I'll say is that meaningful maneuvering room matters. being able to have other options from, I keep coming back to the Philippines context. That's what I work on, and that's both in my scholarly work and in my organizing work. And this is why you said it gets complicated when we think about in the Philippines context. But to have an alternative to these loans that were granted by the IMF and the World Bank and these international finance institutions that required structural adjustments, that required changing domestic policy, that subordinated these social formations into dependence and locked them in to these uneven terms of trade. Being able to have an alternative matters. Another question that I could have added in, and maybe I would have if I'd written it now, thinking about it with these 8 questions, is about poles of development. What are the poles of development? It's a question I ask a lot, and sometimes it's not in whatever I'm reading, which is fine because not everyone's doing the work I'm doing. But if you're thinking about questions of national liberation, questions of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, the question of what people do to reproduce their life should make an appearance, if not should be central. And so another question that could be asked is about the question of poles of development. So on the question of poles of development, though, having an alternative matters. Having meaningful maneuvering room matters. And this is a quote I think Samir Amin talks about. I think Cabral does as well. Meaning maneuver room. It might be Thomas Sankara, but the origin doesn't really matter to me. But the concept is what matters. In the Philippine context, though, it's much different because there's a lot of disputes over the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. Fisher folk are really struggling over these issues of sovereignty. Who controls this highly productive area, both as far as products going through, but also the fish that's being captured and other marine life that's being used to reproduce people's lives. So there's that. There's also within the history of the New People's Army and the now 52-year long protracted People's War in the Philippines of a lack of solidarity from the Chinese Communist Party and to the New People's Army, where the position of the ND movement is that China is a social imperialist power. I don't actually weigh in. I think I will weigh in. I'll say I don't see China as a socialist imperial power. I think it opens up a lot of maneuvering room, not without contradictions, not without and especially in the Philippines context, though, it's much more stark. The levels of domination and exploitation that China theoretically could be supporting the national liberation movement, the protracted People's War, could be giving arms, could be doing so many things, and they're not.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because somebody brought it up. I think actually it was Stephen Shihai recently on. We were talking about, and I know you got to go, so we'll wrap up with this. But he was talking about how in the last year with the war that we've seen, that he's like China and Russia don't have any real direct role, right? But like on the backside, like as I channel and think with Max Isle, he would say, well, that's true, but at the same time, like economically, they're a part of what gives Iran the maneuvering room to support with material, infrastructure or aid or military aid or whatever, certain elements of the axis of resistance, right? So it's not again, like that gives you some idea of the complications in the picture, because it's like, yeah, could they be doing more? Could they take a more definitive stance and actually then open themselves up in further opposition to the United States and the West and what they're doing? They could. It wouldn't be without consequences. It wouldn't be without, like, it's something that they have to weigh, right? But so yeah, I mean,
sitting in my armchair from California, I mean,
right, yeah, it's like, come
I
on, guys,
would,
like,
yeah, no.
yeah. So anyway, but I think that's the reality, that it's like on one level you can say, yeah, there's a lot more that they could do, However, it's very easy for us to make that decision on their behalf, not having to consider anything about what they're considering in terms of what's going into their own decision-making process and so on. So, yeah, I mean, China is complicated, in a lot of ways, and I think unfortunately, um, often people take positions on it one way or the other without really trying to deeply understand, like, what is China actually doing, which is another thing that I appreciate Max Isle, pointing out on certain discussions that we've had of like, okay, I don't think it's this. Like, if anybody wants to check out, we did a couple on agroecology last year with Max Isle right before October 7th on the audio side. And in that discussion, he actually spends a good little bit of time like talking about this and saying like, I don't think it's imperialist. These are the reasons why, but also like it has its own problems and own contradictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, all right.
I would also point people to Mateo Capasso and Ali
Yes,
Kadri to think about these questions about China.
100%. Shout out to all of them. Joma, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. We will have to do it again. In the meantime, I encourage people to check out your podcast, which again is linked in the show notes. Appreciate the engagement, the lively engagement from the audience today. It's been good to be with you all as usual, and I hope to see many of you back here tomorrow. All right. Have a good one, my friend.
All right, you too.